Part 1. The Dead Frequency. Echoes from the Grave. Sorrow is not a state of being, it is a radio frequency. It is a low, persistent hum that vibrates beneath the threshold of the audible, a signal that only the broken can tune into. For most, the world is a symphony of progress, but for those trapped in the amber of a specific moment, reality is nothing more than a loop of white noise. We build shrines out of empty rooms and cathedrals out of unread emails, convinced that if we just find the right decryption key, the past will finally surrender its secrets. But the truth is simpler and far more cruel. Grief is a prison where the inmate is also the architect. Julian Vance sat in the center of his own architectural masterpiece. The apartment was a masterclass in clinical sterility. Minimalist furniture, sharp angles, and a cold, bluish light emanating from a wall of high-definition monitors. There were no photographs on the walls. Julian didn't need them. He had the archives. As a former Tier 1 cybersecurity consultant, he didn't trust paper or ink. He trusted bits. He trusted the binary permanence of the digital dead. Outside, the city of Neo Veridia was a blurred watercolor of neon and smog. A humid, suffocating heat pressed against the reinforced glass of his windows, a precursor to the storm that the local sensors had been predicting for hours. Julian's fingers danced across a haptic keyboard. He was currently re-indexing the 2023 archives, Clara's voice memos, her shopping lists, the GPS pings from her car. It was a ritual. Every night, from 22 to 2 o'clock, he lived in the digital ghost of a woman who had been gone for 3 years. Then, the silence was violated. His personal phone, a hardened, custom-encrypted device running a stripped-down OS and operating on a ghost network, vibrated with a violence that made his heart stutter. An unknown number, 0 caller ID. He tapped the screen. A 12-second audio file downloaded instantly. Julian hesitated, his breath caught in his throat, smelling of stale coffee and isolation. He pressed play. The audio was buried under layers of crushing digital static, the kind of interference you get when a signal passes through a heavy electromagnetic field. But then, a voice cut through the haze. A voice that had been silenced in a twisted wreckage of metal 3 years ago. "Julian, it's me. I don't have much time. Don't let Emma open the basement door. Whatever you do, keep her out." The phone slipped from his hand, clattering onto the glass desk. The voice was unmistakable. It wasn't just the timbre. It was the specific panicked cadence, the way she slightly elongated the U in his name. It was Clara. Before the echoes of the voicemail could fade, a second notification chimed. A text from his 17-year-old daughter, Emma. "Emma, late study group. Home by midnight. Don't wait up." Julian stared at the words until they burned into his retinas. The basement. He looked toward the end of the hallway, where a heavy, reinforced steel door stood like a silent sentinel. He had installed it shortly after the accident, a byproduct of the surging paranoia that had consumed him. It was protected by a biometric keypad and a 12-digit rolling code. A low rumble of thunder shook the floorboards. The storm had arrived. The static shifts. The rain didn't just fall, it attacked. It lashed against the windows like 1,000 desperate fingers trying to claw their way inside. In the flickering light of the lightning, the apartment lost its clinical sheen and took on the aspect of a tomb. Julian stood before the basement door. His hands were shaking, a micro-tremor he couldn't suppress. He reached out and touched the cold metal of the keypad. His breath hitched. Around the edges of the faceplate, the pristine black finish was marred. Long, jagged scratches, fresh silver against the dark mat, suggested someone had tried to force a tool behind the plate. Someone had tried to bypass the physical security tonight. "Emma," he whispered, though he knew the apartment was empty. The irony was a bitter pill. Julian had spent 3 years turning this home into a fortress to protect Emma from a world he no longer trusted. He had monitored her searches, logged her pings, and set geofences around her school. And yet, the warning was coming from the grave, telling him the threat was already inside the perimeter. He pulled his phone and dialed Emma. Ring, ring, ring. "You've reached Emma. Leave a message after the..." He cut off. He tried again. Same result. The storm outside intensified, a violent crescendo of wind that made the building groan. The weather was a mirror of his internal state, a chaotic, swirling mess of fear and redirected guilt. It's a prank, he told the empty hallway. A deep fake. A cruel, digital haunting. But his gut, that primal instinct that survived even when logic failed, told him otherwise. He grabbed his coat and the keys to his SUV. He needed an objective perspective. He needed the law, the official record. The police precinct was a cathedral of weary souls and fluorescent hum. The air smelled of wet wool and industrial cleaner. Detective Sarah Lynn looked at Julian with an expression that sat somewhere between pity and profound irritation. She had seen Julian Vance many times over the last 3 years. Usually when he had discovered a new conspiracy theory regarding the car crash that killed his wife. Julian, she sighed, leaning back in her chair. It's nearly 1 a.m. There's a storm out there that's flooding the lower districts. What are you doing here? Listen to this, Julian said, his voice a jagged edge. He pushed his phone across the desk and played the voicemail. Lynn listened. Her face remained a mask of professional neutrality. When the clip ended, she pushed the phone back. It's a spoof, Julian. A cruel one, I'll grant you. But we're seeing more of these. AI voice cloning is the new playground for trolls and scammers. It's not a spoof, Julian hissed, leaning in. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair matted from the rain. I know her voice. I know the metadata signatures of a fake. This felt organic. For you, this was a closed folder, Julian continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous vibration. A tragedy to be filed away. For me, it was what my Russian mother used to call a Zazivo Zmirovanaya Zizd, a life walled up while still breathing. I haven't left that crash site, Sarah, and now she's calling me. Lynn sighed and turned her monitor toward him. She pulled up the archives from 3 years ago. Look at the screen, Julian. Look at the photos. The car was a fireball. We identified the remains through dental records. There is no world in which Clara Vance is making phone calls in the year 2026. This is grief playing tricks on your ears. Go home. Take a sedative. Talk to your daughter. My daughter is out in this storm. And someone tried to pick the lock on my basement tonight, Julian retorted. Then call a locksmith and get a dog. Lynn said, her patience finally snapping. But don't come here asking me to hunt ghosts. I deal in bodies, Julian, and Clara's body is in the ground. Digital autopsy. Julian drove home in a trance of fury. The city lights blurred into long, distorted streaks of red and white. Lynn was wrong. They were all wrong. They saw the world through the lens of bureaucracy, but Julian saw it through the lens of the machine. And the machine never lied. Back in his office, the adrenaline had reached a cold, vibrating peak. He didn't take a sedative. Instead, he stripped off his wet coat and sat at his terminal. Okay, Clara, he whispered. Let's see where you're hiding. He began the digital autopsy. He extracted the raw audio file from the voicemail and ran it through a forensic suite. He bypassed the user interface layers and dove straight into the packet headers and routing metadata. If this were a VoIP spoof, he would find traces of a proxy server, likely in Eastern Europe or Southeast Asia. He would find a lag in the handoff. He didn't find any of that. Julian's eyes widened as he read the routing logs. The call hadn't come from the internet. It had bypassed the public switch telephone network, PSTN, almost entirely. The signal had been broadcast via a physical IMSI catcher, a Stingray device used to mimic a cell tower. His breath hitched. He ran a triangulation script based on the signal strength indicators buried in the file's hidden logs. The result appeared on his map as a pulsing red circle. The call hadn't been made from the past. It hadn't been made from a hacker's den halfway across the world. The source of the broadcast, the fake cell tower that had sent Clara's voice into his ear, was located less than a mile from his front door. It was coming from the old industrial district just a few blocks away. Julian looked at the basement door again. The scratches, the voice, the proximity. The ghost of his wife wasn't just calling him. She was standing in the shadows of his own neighborhood, broadcasting from the dark. Reality didn't just crack, it shattered. Julian realized that the static he had been hearing for 3 years wasn't the end of the signal. It was just the beginning. Part 2. The Rabbit Hole and the Mirrors. Into the network. The red circle on the monitor pulsed like a dying star, casting a rhythmic, bloody glow across Julian's face. Less than a mile. The signal was a physical entity, a jagged tear in the fabric of his meticulously curated reality, originating from the rusted iron guts of the old industrial district. But a tear, one security mind, does not simply run into the dark without scanning the perimeter first. Paranoia is a form of architecture. It demands that every brick be accounted for, every structural vulnerability mapped. If a predatory signal was operating in his immediate airspace, it had to have an anchor. An infection doesn't just hover in the air, it binds to a host. Julian sat back down at his terminal, his fingers moving over the haptic keys not with panic, but with the cold, mechanical precision of an executioner clearing a jammed rifle. If you were out there, he whispered to the pulsing red, you had to get inside first. He initiated a deep, low-level network audit of his own home router, a heavily modified, enterprise-grade Cisco gateway that he had programmed to log every packet, every handshake, every microscopic shift in bandwidth. For 3 years, he had believed this house was a closed loop, an island of absolute digital sovereignty. The scan ran. The progress bar crawled forward, a thin green line cutting through the black screen. 20%, 45%, 70%. A discrepancy appeared. It was a phantom thread, so thin that any standard network diagnostic would have discarded it as background radiation or a routine firmware heartbeat. A man-in-the-middle MITM proxy attack was actively running on his local network. It was beautiful in its cruelty, a silent, parasitic twin data stream that had been mirroring his entire hard drive, his keystrokes, his active memory dumps, and routing them out into the ether. And it had been doing it for months. Julian's breath turned to ice. He wasn't a hunter tracking a ghost. He was a specimen under a glass slide, being watched by one. He traced the hardware MAC address of the siphoning device. It wasn't an external intrusion from a distant country. The source of the internal leak was broadcasting from a specific IP node assigned to the wireless repeater located upstairs. In Emma's bedroom, Julian stood up so fast his chair slammed against the glass desk, the sound echoing through the sterile apartment like a gunshot. He walked down the corridor, his boots heavy on the hardwood floor, past the basement door with its fresh, silver scratches, and ascended the stairs to his daughter's room. The door to Emma's room was covered in old stickers, faded constellations, and punk rock band logos from a childhood she had abruptly discarded after her mother's death. Julian pushed the door open. The room smelled of lavender, clean laundry, and the distinct ozone tang of overheating electronics. He didn't hesitate. He tore through her space, not with the anger of a parent, but with the systematic thoroughness of a counterintelligence agent dismantling a safe house. He checked the desk, the closet beneath the mattress. Nothing. Then, his eyes fell upon the drywall beside her desk, near the baseboard. The paint was slightly uneven. He knelt, pulling a pocket knife from his jeans, and pried at the edge of the plastic cable outlet cover. It gave way with a sharp snap. Hidden inside the wall cavity, tapped directly into the house's main Ethernet backbone, was a custom-built Raspberry Pi unit, its tiny green and red LEDs blinking in a frantic, mocking rhythm. It was a rogue node, a digital parasite feeding on his life. Julian connected his field tablet to the Pi's diagnostic port, bypassing its encryption layers using a brute force exploit he had written himself a lifetime ago. The terminal screen flickered, revealing the active process logs. It wasn't just a data siphon. It was an open communication channel. An encrypted local chat log was active on the screen, reflecting a conversation that had occurred less than an hour ago between Emma's profile and an anonymous user identified only by the single character, C. C. He's at the police station. The Lynn distraction worked. Get the key override from his safe now. Emma, I'm trying. The faceplate is stuck. I don't have much time before the storm knocks out the grid. See, move Emma. If he catches you, the loop closes. Bring the terminal to the drop point. Julian stared at the character C. Clara. The room seemed to tilt. The walls, painted a soft gray, felt like they were pressing inward, suffocating him. His own daughter, the girl he had protected, the girl he had built a fortress for, was the insider threat. She was the hand that had opened the gate for the wolf. Betrayal is never a sudden storm, Julian murmured, his voice hollow, quoting an old security adage he used to drill into corporate executives. It is a slow leak in the hull that you choose to ignore until the water is at your knees. He tore the Raspberry Pi out of the wall, its wires snapping with a dry pop, and pocketed it. He had the drop point's network coordinates now. The Phantom signal wasn't just a localized broadcast anymore. It was a physical destination. The paper trail. The rain was a solid wall of water as Julian's SUV tore through the flooded streets of the industrial sector. The windshield wipers slammed back and forth in a futile attempt to clear his vision, but the world remained a shifting, distorted nightmare of neon smears and black asphalt. The GPS coordinates extracted from the rogue node led him to the edge of the old shipping yards, a wasteland of abandoned manufacturing plants and rusted containers that the city had forgotten 50 years ago. This was the graveyard of industry, a place where things went to rot in silence. He parked the vehicle in the shadow of a collapsed crane, leaving the headlights off. He stepped out into the downpour, the cold water instantly soaking through his jacket, chilling him to the bone. But he barely felt it. The fire in his chest, a toxic mixture of rage, terror, and a desperate, fragile hope, was too hot. He approached the target structure, an old, half-demolished iron foundry. Its jagged roofline bit into the lightning-streaked sky like a row of broken teeth. Julian pushed open a rusted metal side door, slipping inside. The silence inside the warehouse was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic, heavy thud-thud-thud of rain striking the corrugated iron roof 30 feet above and cascading down through holes in the ceiling, creating miniature waterfalls in the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of wet soot, iron filings, and rot. He turned on his tactical flashlight, its beam a sharp, clean white cylinder cutting through the gloom. He followed the signal strength on his tablet. The IMSI catcher was close. The network handshake was growing stronger with every step he took deeper into the labyrinth of rusted machinery and crumbling brick walls. In the center of the old foundry floor, beneath a section of intact roof, he found it. It was a makeshift tactical command center, completely out of place among the industrial ruins. A folding plastic table held a rack of high-end servers, multiple monitors glowing with a low, green command line interface, and an array of directional radio antennas pointed through a shattered window directly toward his residential district, directly at his home. Julian approached the table, his boots splashing in a shallow puddle. His flashlight beam swept across the monitors. They were displaying real-time feeds of his own home security system. He saw his empty living room, his office, the dark hallway leading to the basement. The system hadn't just been mirrored, it had been entirely compromised. Then, the flashlight beam caught something on the table's edge. A small, velvet-lined tray. Julian reached out, his hand trembling so violently he almost knocked over a diagnostic monitor. He picked up the object resting in the center of the tray. It was a silver wedding band, its surface scratched but unmistakable. Inside the band, an inscription was engraved in delicate, elegant script, JV, and CV, forever is a code. This was Claire's ring. The ring she had been wearing the day she drove her sedan off the State Route Bridge. The ring that the police report stated had been lost in the intense, magnesium-fueled fire that had consumed the vehicle's cabin. Julian pressed the cold metal against his forehead, a ragged sob tearing from his throat. The smell of the ring, or perhaps it was just his mind playing tricks, carried a faint trace of her perfume, a delicate note of jasmine buried beneath the smell of industrial rain. Ow! He choked out into the empty warehouse. How are you here? The ring wasn't a digital ghost. It was physical proof, a resurrection wrapped in silver. But as he stared at the ring, the analytical, paranoid part of his brain, the monster that kept him awake at night, noted detail. There was no soot on the velvet tray. There was no dust on the silver. It had been placed here recently. Tonight, he looked down at the main monitor on the desk. A command line was executing a script, a localization routine for a mobile unit. The IP address matched the active cellular transmitter Emma had been communicating with. The signal wasn't stationary anymore. It was moving. It was retreating from the warehouse, heading into the dense, black tree line that bordered the industrial property and extended for miles into the state park. He dropped the ring into his pocket, his hand tightening into a fist. The paper trail had ended. The hunt had begun. The tree line. The forest at night was a primordial entity, a black ocean of shifting leaves and grasping branches that seemed to swallow the light of Julian's flashlight after only a few yards. The storm was at its peak now. The wind howled through the canopy like a choir of the damned, bending massive oak trees and sending cascades of freezing water down upon him. Julian ran through the mud, his boots slipping, his face torn by low-hanging briars. He didn't care. He was tracking the signal on his tablet, his eyes locked onto the green triangle that represented the mobile transmitter. The forest was a perfect metaphor for his own mind. A chaotic, unmapped wilderness where every shadow looked like an enemy, where the path behind him had already been washed away by the rain, leaving him with nowhere to go but forward into the dark. The GPS coordinates converged near an old fire road, a dirt track that had long since been overgrown by weeds and saplings. Through the thick curtain of rain, Julian spotted the silhouette of a vehicle. It was an old, dark sedan, its engine idling with a low, wet rumble, its headlights turned off. Julian slowed his pace, drawing a compact Glock 19 from his belt holster, a weapon he kept registered but hidden, an ultimate insurance policy against the chaos of the outside world. He approached the driver's side window, his weapon raised, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He flashed the light into the cabin. The beam illuminated a face. It wasn't Clara. It was Emma. She was sitting in the driver's seat, a ruggedized, military-spec Panasonic Toughbook laptop resting on her knees, her fingers flying across the keys with the same frantic, precise cadence that Julian used when he was hunting a network threat. A high-gain radio antenna was suction cupped to the inside of the windshield, its cable running directly into her machine. Julian threw open the car door, the wind ripping it from his hand and slamming it against its hinges. "Out! Get out of the car!" he roared above the storm. Emma didn't scream. She didn't even look surprised. She slowly lowered the laptop screen, her face pale, her eyes wide and dark, reflecting a mixture of intense terror and cold, calculated defiance. She stepped out into the mud, her jacket soaking instantly, facing her father beneath the weeping trees. "Julian," she said, her voice small but steady against the gale. She didn't call him Dad. She hadn't called him that in 3 years. "What is this?" Julian screamed, his gun hand shaking as he pointed the flashlight at her face, the weapon lowered toward the ground but still visible. The network siphon, the voice, the ring. "Who are you working for, Emma? Who is out there?" Emma took a step toward him, her boots sinking into the mire. She didn't look at the gun. She looked directly into his fractured, bloodshot eyes. "There is no who." "Julian," she shouted back, the rain plastering her hair to her forehead. "It's us. It's always been us. Don't lie to me." Julian bellowed, his sanity tearing at the seams like wet paper. "I know her voice. I lived inside her archives for 3 years, Emma. Every cadence, every breath, it belongs to her. You can't fake that. That was your mother. Mom survived 3 years ago, Julian." Emma screamed into his face, her voice cracking with an emotion so raw it cut through his paranoia like a scalpel. Julian froze, the world around him slowing down, the sound of the rain fading into a distant, muffled hum. "And now," Emma continued, her eyes hardening into flint, "we are using your own sickness against you. We are catching you on your own wire. We're using your paranoia to bring you down." A manic fury, a white-hot wave of absolute denial, washed over Julian's brain. His mind rejected the words. It was a foreign code, a virus attempting to overwrite his core operating system. Clara couldn't have left him. She couldn't have chosen the dark over him. He lunged forward, grabbing Emma by the arm with a grip that was too tight, too desperate. He slammed her laptop shut and dragged her toward his SUV parked 100 yards away down the track. "You're coming with me," he hissed, his voice no longer human, but the rasp of a machine running on a fatal error loop. "We're going home. We're going to look at the logs. We're going to find the truth." Emma didn't fight him as he threw her into the passenger seat. She just looked at him with an expression that wasn't fear anymore. It was executioner's pity, the lens of truth. The return to the townhome was a silent blur of speed and hydroplaning tires. Julian dragged Emma through the front door, slamming it shut behind them and throwing the heavy deadbolts. The electronic locks engaged with a series of metallic clicks that sounded like handcuffs locking into place. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to the couch in the living room. Emma sat, her wet clothes dripping onto the white leather, her face impassive. She looked like a prisoner who had already accepted her sentence, or perhaps a chess player who knew the opponent was moving into a checkmate they couldn't see. Julian ran to his primary workstation. His hands were wet, his skin cold, but his mind was burning. He booted up the master security system, bypassing the standard user dashboard and entering the root directory for the closed-circuit television, CCTV, archives. He pulled up the continuous 24/7 logs from the last 72 hours, the high-definition infrared cameras that monitored every square inch of the property's exterior and interior hallways. "You said she's out there," Julian muttered, his eyes darting across the multi-camera grid as the footage began to play at 4x speed. "You said you were working together. Let's see the perimeter logs. Let's see where she approached the house." He scrubbed through the timeline. He watched himself sitting at the desk, night after night. He watched Emma coming home from school, going to her room, doing her homework. Then, he hit the timestamp from 36 hours ago. 3:14 a.m. Julian stopped the playback. His finger hovered over the trackpad, his breath stopping in his lungs. The camera angle was from the main corridor, looking directly down the narrow hallway toward the basement door. In the footage, the house was dark. The door to Emma's room opened slowly. The 17-year-old girl stepped out into the hallway. She wasn't carrying a laptop or a hacking tool. She was carrying a silver tray. On the tray was a bowl of soup, a glass of water, and a small pill bottle. Julian watched, his vision tunneling until the screen was the only thing that existed in the universe. Emma walked down the hallway. She didn't look at the biometric keypad. She didn't try to enter a code. She didn't have a lockpick. Instead, she sank to her knees in front of the reinforced steel door. Her shoulders began to shake. She was crying. The infrared camera caught the wet tracks of tears reflecting the invisible light. She leaned her forehead against the cold metal, then reached down toward the low-wall maintenance hatch, a small, heavy-gauge steel panel meant for running fiber optic cables under the floorboards. She punched a separate mechanical code into the hatch. It clicked open. With mechanical, heartbreaking care, she slid a small container of water and a ration pack inside the structural bypass cavity, pushing it until it cleared the inner security seal. She was feeding the house's foundation. She was feeding a prisoner. She stood there for another 10 minutes, her hand pressed against the metal, listening to something through the ventilation grill near the baseboard. Someone was speaking to her from the inside. Someone was consuming the food. Julian turned his head slowly, his neck popping with a dry, calcified sound. He looked away from the monitor and stared down the long, dark hallway toward the basement door. The keypad was dark. The scratches were fresh. Emma hadn't been trying to break in. She had been communicating with someone who was already inside. Someone had been down there, beneath his feet, while he slept, while he archived, while he grieved. Julian looked back at Emma, who was sitting on the couch, staring at him through the gloom of the living room. "Who is in my basement, Emma?" Julian whispered, his voice cracking, the last remnants of his sanity beginning to drift away like smoke in a gale. Emma didn't answer with words. She just pointed her finger down toward the floorboards, toward the dark earth below the concrete foundations of the house. And from the end of the hallway, deep within the structure of the building, came a sound that didn't go through the airwaves or the digital networks. It was a physical vibration, a low, rhythmic tapping against the metal vents. Top, top, top. The signal was coming from inside the house. Part 3. The architecture of madness. Fracturing. The low, rhythmic tap-tap-tap radiating from the ventilation shaft did not sound like metal hitting metal. It sounded like bone. It sounded like a desperate, calcified hand reaching through the deep, subterranean layers of the house, trying to claw its way back into the light of the living. A blinding flash of lightning struck the transformer in the alleyway, just outside. The sound was an immediate, deafening detonation that shook the townhome to its concrete foundations. Simultaneously, every monitor in Julian's office sputtered, pixelated into a violent mesh of neon green artifacts, and died. The hum of the cooling fans ceased. The secondary backup systems whined, tripped, and failed. The house was plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. The only illumination came from the erratic, strobe-like pulses of the storm outside, casting long, monstrous shadows across the minimalist living room. In the strobe light, Emma looked like a marble statue sitting on the white leather couch. Unmoving, unblinking, her eyes two pools of infinite, frozen obsidian. Julian stood paralyzed in the center of his dead office. His fingers still hovered over the haptic keyboard, but the haptic feedback was gone. It was just cold, inert glass. The loss of his screens was a physical amputation. For 3 years, those monitors had been his eyes, his digital armor against a hostile universe. Without them, he was naked, stripped of his administrative privileges, cast down into the raw, unparsed chaos of reality. "The grid is down," Julian rasped, his voice sounding thin, like dry leaves scraping across a driveway. "The local node, it's a localized blackout. I need to bring the secondary diesel generator online. I need to check the logs. The footage was corrupted. It had to be corrupted. You modified the file, Emma. You injected a payload into my CCTV system." From the shadows of the couch, Emma's voice drifted toward him, devoid of teenage anger, stripped of all emotion except a terrible, ancient fatigue. "There is no script running, Julian. There is no payload. You're looking for a bug in the software because you cannot face the failure of your own hardware." The memory didn't return as a flash. It executed like a delayed cron job. Julian's mind suddenly mapped the network path back to the police database. He remembered the midnight intrusion 3 years ago. He remembered injecting the deepfake dental records into the municipal archive from his own terminal. Sarah Lynn hadn't lied to him at the precinct. She was just reading the data he had authored. He had social engineered his own reality. "Shut up," Julian screamed, his hand flying to his head, his fingers tangling in his wet hair. The micro tremor in his hands had escalated into a full-body shudder. "I am the administrator here. I control the perimeter. I map the connections. Clara died on State Route 9. I saw the electronic case file. I saw the ash." Emma slowly stood up from the couch. In the next flash of lightning, she appeared closer, a shifting specter in the storm-lit room. "You saw what you programmed yourself to see," she whispered. Her voice seemed to echo through the empty vents, multiplying, vibrating in his teeth. "Your mind broke 3 years ago, Julian. It didn't break from grief. It broke from design. You couldn't handle the truth of what you did, so you partitioned your own memory. You created a secure sector in your brain, locked the door, and threw away the key. But the data didn't disappear. It's been rewriting your background processes for 36 months. No." Julian roared, drawing his Glock 19 with a panicked, jerky motion. The weapon felt impossibly heavy in the dark. "It's a system conflict. A system conflict. I am the administrator." He didn't point the gun at Emma. He pointed it down the hallway toward the Sentinel door. The low, rhythmic tap-tap-tap from the floor vents was getting faster, transforming from a plea into a command. Emma didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still as another flash of lightning bleached the room white. "The storm didn't trip the grid, Julian," she said softly, her voice cutting through the mechanical rattle of his breathing. "I did. The Raspberry Pi wasn't siphoning your files. It was running an automated decryption loop on the basement lock for the last 48 hours. The IMSI catcher in the woods? It wasn't Mom calling you. It was the lock's terminal, broadcasting its final status report to my laptop. Right on cue, The heavy steel door at the end of the hallway emitted a long, hydraulic hiss. The biometric pad flashed a solid, mocking green. The heavy deadbolts retracted one by one with the sound of snapping bone. Julian dropped his gun. It hit the hardwood floor with a dull thud. The ventilation shaft went completely silent, the tapping stopping instantly as the reinforced door slowly swung inward, heavy, thick, and opening into an absolute, unlit void. From the pitch-black opening of the basement, a wet, ragged breath exhaled into the corridor. And then a voice drifted out, weak, hoarse from years of concrete air, but holding that exact, terrifyingly organic cadence. "Julian, the loop is closed." "Then why are you shaking, Julian?" Emma asked, her voice dropping to a low, chilling frequency that seemed to bypass his ears and strike his spine. "Why are you afraid of the door at the end of the hall? If there's nothing down there but old storage boxes and Christmas decorations, why is your master key burning a hole in your pocket?" The low tapping from the vent stopped. In its place came a wet, wheezing sound, a long, drawn-out exhalation that crawled up through the metal ducts and spilled into the dark living room. It sounded like a throat choked with dust, trying to form a syllable. Julian's mind fractured. The neat, binary world of ones and zeros, of firewall rules and secure handshakes, dissolved into an ocean of screaming static. The logic gates had failed. The overflow error was cascading through his consciousness. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the physical master key override, a heavy, brass-coated security tool designed to bypass the electronic lock solenoids if the internal battery array ever died. The metal felt ice-cold against his palm, yet it burned like white phosphorus. "I'll prove it," Julian whispered, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely articulate the words. "I'll open the door. I'll show you the empty shelves. I'll show you the dust. And then I'm going to lock you in your room, Emma. I'm going to clean the system. I'm going to wipe the drive. Open it, Julian," Emma said, her voice receding into the shadows as she stepped back. "Open the vault. Let's see who is sitting in your trash bin." Opening the vault, Julian walked down the corridor. Every step felt like he was wading through wet cement. The air in the hallway was freezing, thick with the smell of old iron and wet earth that seemed to be bubbling up from floorboards. He reached the end of the hall. The reinforced steel door loomed before him, a massive slab of absolute blackness in the dark. The biometric keypad was dead, its LED screen unlit, a blank mirror reflecting nothing. Julian's hand shook so violently he dropped the master key override. It hit the hardwood floor with a loud, metallic clang that sounded like a funeral bell. He fell to his knees, his hands clawing at the floor in the dark until his fingers brushed against the cold brass. He stood up, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He found the physical keyway hidden beneath a magnetic plastic strip on the side of the lock faceplate. He inserted the key. The mechanism was heavy. It required a two-stage rotation to release the internal deadbolts. Click! The first stage engaged. The sound echoed through the hollow walls of the house like a bone snapping. Click! The second stage released. Julian grabbed the heavy steel handle and pulled. The door, hung on industrial-grade precision hinges, swung open with a low, hydraulic groan. Behind the door was not a flight of wooden stairs leading to an ordinary residential cellar. Behind the door was a descending concrete ramp, painted in a dull, institutional gray, lit only by the faint, greenish glow of emergency chemical light sticks that Emma had taped along the walls weeks prior. Emma followed him at a distance of precisely 6 feet. She had her ruggedized smartphone raised, its camera lens catching the strobing light from the living room behind them, recording every movement, every breath, every micro-expression on her father's face. Julian descended the ramp. The walls were lined with thick, black soundproofing foam, the kind used in professional recording studios or high-security government interview rooms. The air was dead, completely devoid of circulation, smelling heavily of chemical disinfectant, old linen, and a sweet, sickening undertone of organic decay. At the bottom of the ramp stood a second door, a heavy, airtight cleanroom door with a reinforced glass viewing port. Julian approached the window. He pressed his face against the cold glass, his flashlight beam cutting through the interior darkness. The room inside was not a storage space. It was a perfectly preserved, retrofitted medical isolation cell. In the center of the room stood a heavy iron hospital bed, its frame bolted directly into the concrete floor. Thick, industrial-grade leather restraint straps were attached to the headboard and footboard, their surfaces cracked and stained with sweat and old oil. Along the back wall sat a stainless steel counter covered in orderly rows of empty prescription vials, syringe casings, and neat, leather-bound notebooks. Julian's flashlight beam danced erratically across the counter, finally settling on one of the notebooks. The cover was labeled with a black marker, Patient Observation Log, Phase 4. Julian pushed the cleanroom door open, the rubber seals hissing as the vacuum pressure released. He walked toward the counter like a man walking toward a firing squad. He picked up the notebook. He opened the first page. The handwriting was beautiful, precise, completely devoid of tremor. It was written in an elegant, left-handed slant with a fine-tipped black gel pen. It was his own handwriting. Day 412, the log read, "The subject's compliance remains low. The chemical restraint regimen, haloperidol/lorazepam 4 milligrams, is maintaining baseline sedation, but cognitive degradation is becoming pronounced." She still insists on asking about the daughter. She doesn't understand that the perimeter is the only thing keeping them safe. If she leaves the network, she will be intercepted. I cannot allow the data to leak. Julian dropped the notebook. It hit the concrete floor, its pages fluttering open to reveal month after month, year after year of meticulous daily logs, all written by his hand, all tracking the slow, systematic chemical destruction of a human being. "No," Julian whispered, his voice disappearing into the soundproofing foam. "No, this isn't mine. I didn't write this. Someone copied my handwriting. A digital plot, an optical character synthesis. Look at the dates, Julian," Emma said, her voice coming from the doorway, her phone still recording, her arm rock steady. "Look at the dates. It starts 3 years ago, 2 weeks before the accident. The echo chamber. The moral architecture of Julian's universe didn't just collapse, it inverted. The hero of the story, the grieving, hypervigilant father who had sacrificed everything to protect his daughter from a dangerous world, was gone. In his place stood the monster, the jailer, the architect of the cage. The memories didn't return as a flood. They returned as a system restore, an automated script overriding his conscious mind with cold, unyielding data. 3 years ago, Clara hadn't died in a car crash. Clara had discovered what Julian was doing in his corporate cybersecurity role. The illegal data harvesting, the shadow profiles he was building on political dissidents, the massive financial architecture of espionage he had constructed. She had threatened to go to the federal prosecutors. She had packed her bags. She had taken Emma's hand. And Julian, whose mind was already warping under the pressure of absolute digital control, had seen her departure not as a divorce, but as a critical data breach. A system vulnerability that had to be contained at all costs. He had intercepted her on the road. He hadn't crashed her car. He had drugged her, staged the vehicle's fiery descent over the state route bridge using an accelerant and a stolen medical corpse from the university morgue, and brought his wife here. Into the basement he had spent 6 months reinforcing. He had locked her away to protect his secrets, and then his mind had failed. The human psyche cannot survive seeing itself as a monster. To protect his own sanity, his brain had executed a massive dissociative partition. He had invented the grief. He had invented the tragedy. He had built the monitors upstairs to watch for a threat that he had already locked in his basement. He had spent 3 years mourning a woman he was feeding through a slot in the door every morning during his fugue states. Julian fell to his knees in the center of the isolation cell, his hands clutching his temples, his fingernails digging into his skin until thin lines of dark blood ran down his cheeks. He was screaming, but the soundproofing foam swallowed the noise, turning his agony into a dry, pathetic rattle. "I locked her away," he whispered, his eyes rolling back into his head. I was the firewall. I was the cage. You were the monster, Papa, Emma said, her voice finally breaking, a single, heavy tear escaping her eye and running down her pale cheek. You built this bunker to hide her from the world, and in the end, you just hid your own monstrosity from yourself. But she's alive, Julian gasped, a desperate, pathetic light illuminating his ruined face as he looked toward the back of the cell. The tapping, the food tray. Emma, she's still here. We can open the lock. I can save her. I can fix the code. Emma stepped fully into the room, her boots crunching on the dropped notebook. She lowered her phone, her eyes locking onto his with the finality of a judge delivering a terminal verdict. Open your phone, Julian, she said softly. The network is coming back up. Look at the last file. A sharp, electronic chime echoed through the cell. The local cellular grid had reset. Julian's phone, resting on the floor beside him, lit up with a brilliant, blinding white glare. A notification was flashing on the screen. It was a system log file, an automated output from an advanced AI voice synthesis software located on Emma's local network drive. Julian picked up the phone with numb, dead fingers. He opened the log. The screen displayed an audio wave diagram. It showed the words of the voicemail he had received earlier that night. Julian, it's me. I don't have much time. Don't let Emma open the basement door. Beneath the wave diagram was a text line showing the source material used to train the voice model. It was a compilation of Clara's old voice memos from 2023, sliced, parsed, and reconstructed by an advanced machine learning algorithm that Emma had spent 6 months programming. You made the file, Julian whispered, his mind spinning in a final, fatal loop. The voicemail, it was a clone. I had to, Emma said, her voice shaking now, the mask of the calculating hacker completely dissolving into the face of a broken child. Mom isn't alive, Julian. She died in this bed 2 years ago. She died of medical neglect because your fugue states grew longer, because you forgot to come down here for 3 weeks while you were hospitalized for your grief nervous breakdown. I found her body months ago, Julian. I found her right here, rotting in the dark. Julian stared at her, his jaw dropping open, his breath stopping. But I couldn't open the door. Emma wept, her voice rising to a screech that filled the soundproof cell. The biometric lock required your specific thumbprint and your specific rolling code. If I told the police, you would have cleaned the system, you would have destroyed the logs, you would have lied your way out of it like you always do. I had to wait until I was strong enough to build a trap. I knew that the only thing that could force your broken mind to enter that code was your own paranoia. I knew that if you thought she was trying to get out, if you thought I was trying to help her, you would open the vault yourself. Emma pointed to the far corner of the cell, where a heavy, newly cemented concrete wall partition stood, sealing off the old utility alcove. She's behind the wall, Julian. I couldn't get her out. I had to let the digital ghost do it. Static fade. The world outside the basement was suddenly filled with a rhythmic, pulsing light. Not the white strobe of the lightning, but the mechanical, alternating red and blue glare of emergency sirens. The heavy thud of tactical boots echoed through the house upstairs. The front door, the pristine, reinforced barrier Julian had built to keep the chaos of the world out, was shattered within seconds by a hydraulic ram. Police. Nobody move. Hands where I can see them. The shouts cascaded down the concrete ramp, but inside the cell, the air remained dead and silent. Detective Sarah Lynn descended the ramp first, her service weapon raised, her face a pale, horrified mask as her tactical light swept across the soundproofing foam, the restraints, the medical logs, and finally, the broken figure of Julian Vance sitting in the mud of his own ruined mind. Jesus Christ, Lynn whispered, lowering her weapon as 2 heavily armed officers bypassed her, grabbing Julian by the arms and dragging him to his feet. Julian didn't resist. He didn't move a muscle. His body was entirely limp, his limbs heavy and useless like wet clay. His eyes were wide, vacant, completely unblinking, staring into the dark corner of the cell where the concrete wall stood. His pupils were fully dilated, reflecting the flashing red and blue lights filtering down from the high basement windows. "Clara," he murmured, his lips moving but producing barely any sound. It was a loop, a dead sector of code executing over and over in the ruins of his prefrontal cortex. "Clara, the signal is clean. The perimeter is secure." "Clara." Emma sank to her knees on the wet concrete floor, her arms wrapping around her own chest, rocking back and forth as a female officer draped a heavy yellow emergency blanket over her trembling shoulders. She didn't look at her father as they dragged him past her up the ramp. She just stared at the dropped phone on the floor, its screen still glowing with the static wave diagram of her mother's fake voice. They lifted Julian into the back of the armored medical transport vehicle parked in the flooded driveway. The rain was slowing down now, turning into a miserable, freezing drizzle that washed the dirt into the gutters of Neo Veridia. As the doors of the transport vehicle slammed shut, locking him into a new, smaller cage, Julian looked through the reinforced wire glass window. The neon lights of the city were no longer data points to be monitored. They were just smears of meaningless color. The world was no longer an architecture of connection. It was just noise. His mind completely disengaged from the external network. The administrative privileges were permanently revoked. Inside his head, the monitors flickered one last time, displaying nothing but a harsh, cold, blinding field of white television static. The frequency was dead. The transmission was over. And in the center of that static, the voice of a woman who had been buried twice whispered one final, corrupted syllable into the dark before the screen went entirely black. The static aftermath. The transport vehicle did not hum. It rattled with a loose, metallic vibration that felt entirely uncoupled from the rest of the physical world. Inside the cramped compartment, the red illumination of the tactical roof light bathed Julian's hands in a permanent, synthetic crimson. He looked down at his fingers. They were perfectly still now. The micro-tremor that had defined his life for 3 years had vanished, replaced by the profound, heavy inertia of a machine whose primary drive belt had snapped at high velocity. The world outside the wire mesh window was receding. Neo Veridia was turning off its lights, one block at a time, as if the city itself were a terminal entering a low-power sleep state. For the first 48 hours in the psychiatric isolation ward of the state penitentiary, there were no questions. There were only measurements. They measured his pulse, his pupil dilation, his neural response to high-frequency auditory stimuli. They wrote their reports in a clinical, structured shorthand that Julian, even in his state of total psychological collapse, recognized as just another form of documentation. Another attempt to wrap an administrative boundary around something inherently unmanageable. Detective Sarah Lynn visited him once, on a Tuesday morning when the rain had finally stopped, leaving the world outside the high, reinforced glass windows looking washed out and gray. She sat across from him in the visiting room, her trench coat smelling of damp asphalt and low-grade tobacco. She didn't bring a notepad. She didn't bring a recording device. "We opened the wall, Julian," she said, her voice dropping into the low, gravelly register of someone who had spent 30 years looking at the things humans do to each other in the dark. "The forensics team, they found her. Exactly where Emma said she would be." The medical examiner confirmed the timeline. 2 years. Give or take a few weeks. Julian didn't look at her face. He was staring at the laminate surface of the table, tracing the artificial wood grain with his eyes, searching for a pattern, a repeating sequence, a line of code he could exploit to force a system reboot. "You know what the strangest part is?" Lynn continued, leaning forward, her breath fogging slightly on the polished table. "The dental records you gave us 3 years ago after the crash, the ones we used to identify the body in the river, you altered them. You hacked into the state health database from your home terminal, extracted the records of a missing woman from 2 counties over, and swapped the digital signatures with Clara's. You didn't just lie to yourself, Julian. You rewrote the state's infrastructure to validate the fantasy." Julian's lips parted, a dry, clicking sound escaping his throat. "The data must be clean. If the input is corrupted, the system returns an error." Lynn looked at him for a long time, her eyes filled with a heavy, professional sorrow. There is no system left, Julian. There's just a girl in a group home who refuses to speak, and a box of old tapes we found in your attic that you forgot to encrypt. She stood up, her keys rattling against her belt. A sharp, mechanical sound that made Julian's eyes twitch toward the corner of the room where the security camera was mounted. "Goodbye, Julian," she said. "I hope you find whatever frequency you're looking for." The closed loop. Months dissolved into each other like corrupted video frames. In the facility, time was not measured by hours or minutes, but by the regular intervals of the electronic wall clock that jumped forward with a distinct, rhythmic clack every 60 seconds. Julian spent his days in the corner of the recreation yard, his back pressed against the chain-link fence, his face turned toward the sky. The other inmates left him alone. He carried the specific, untouchable aura of a man who had already carried out his own execution. He didn't think about the trial. He didn't think about the lawyers or the sentences. His mind had retreated into a smaller, safer subroutine. He was rebuilding the apartment in his head, room by room, wire by wire, correcting the errors in the architecture. In his memory, the basement door remained locked. In his memory, the scratches on the faceplate were gone. He was patching the vulnerability. One afternoon, a package arrived from the State Social Services Department. It was a standard issue box containing the personal effects that had been cleared from Emma's room after the property was seized by the Asset Forfeiture Division. Because Julian was still technically her legal guardian until the final termination papers were signed by the court, the system required that he sign the manifest. Inside the box, beneath a layer of old textbooks and woolen sweaters, was a small, unlabeled optical disc, a mini DV tape from an old camcorder that Julian had used during their first year in the townhome, before the paranoia had fully calcified into a cage. The orderly in the day room permitted him to use the communal media player. Julian inserted the disc into the drive. The machine whined, its laser head clicking as it sought the track headers. The screen flickered to life. The video was shaky, shot in the bright, overexposed light of a summer morning 3 years ago. Clara was standing in the kitchen, her hair tied back with a green ribbon, her hands covered in flour. She was laughing at something Julian had said from behind the camera. In the background, a 7-year-old Emma was sitting at the table, trying to teach a mechanical dog how to code using a toy tablet. "Julian, turn that thing off," Clara said, her voice clear, vibrant, completely free of the digital static that had haunted his dreams. "You don't need to document everything. Some things are meant to just happen and disappear. If you keep recording, you're going to forget how to live in the room." The camera panned down, catching Julian's own reflection in the glass of the microwave door. He looked younger, his face less gaunt, his eyes still retaining a faint, human warmth before the numbers took over. "I'm not recording to remember." His own voice came from the speaker, a voice he no longer recognized. "I'm recording to ensure the file doesn't degrade." "Everything degrades, Clara. The tape is the only thing that holds." Clara stopped, wiping her hands. She looked directly into the camera lens, her smile fading into an expression of profound, clairvoyant sadness. "The tape isn't holding us, Julian," she said softly. "It's just holding you." The video track suddenly glitched. A jagged line of static tore through the center of the frame. Horizontal lines of silver and green, tracking errors scrambling her face into a mosaic of digital noise. The audio channel caught in a loop, repeating her last word over and over. "Holding, holding, holding." Julian sat in the plastic chair, the blue light of the television screen reflecting off his empty, hollow eyes. He didn't reach out to turn it off. He didn't call for the orderly. He simply leaned his head back against the concrete wall, tuned his ears to the low, 60 hertz hum of the television transformer, and let the white noise fill the empty spaces where his life used to be. The loop was finally closed. The signal was dead, and there was nothing left to monitor but the dark.